Dear all, I would like to welcome you to this session on academic freedom with Paul van der Heijden as the speaker of the session. I would especially like to welcome also our online audience that I understood is really numerous and active in this conference. We will have the presentation by our speaker, and in the meanwhile, if you have any questions, you can prepare them and hand them in already in Slido using the QR code provided here, which we will use in the discussion after the presentation. Our speaker today is Paul van der Heijden. He is an emeritus professor of international law at Leiden University, and he has a lot of experience with academic freedom as an academic, but also as an administrator in academia. He worked 15 years as an administrator, was also a rector magnificus of our university in Leiden a while ago from 2007 to 2013. And he is also a member of the Royal Netherlands Academy of Arts and Sciences. And in his role, he chaired a committee about academic freedom, which produced a report in 2021, so very recent, about academic freedom, its challenges and perspectives in the Netherlands. So very warm welcome to Paul van der Heijden. Thank you for accepting to be here.
Thank you, Susa, for your kind introduction. Dear colleagues, dear participants in ESOF 2022, first of all, of course, I would like to thank the organization, the ESOF 2022 organization, for inviting me to talk about academic freedom. And thank you for the possibility to have here this morning a discussion and dialogue with all of you on this important topic. As I will explain in this lecture, continuous dialogue about academic freedom is vital because we cannot take it for granted anymore. We talk about freedom. And today is 14 juillet, the 14th of July. And if you have ever been in France on this day, you know that that is a national holiday. People are celebrating 14 juillet everywhere, in little cities, villages, in big cities like Paris. It's a national holiday. And they are celebrating the start of the French Revolution, the storming of the Bastille on this very day in 1789. And 2 months later, in 1789, came the publication of La Déclaration des droits de l'homme et du citoyen, and it contained a list of what we call today universal human rights. And the same list, more or less the same list, was part of the Bill of Rights during more or less the same time in 1798 in Washington, where the United States was born. And in 1798 in Washington, after the Independence War, they also had their First Amendment on the Constitution and the Bill of Rights. So we are in the area with academic freedom, freedom of expression, freedom of thought, freedom of thinking. We are in the area of fundamental rights. And the brilliant idea of putting core values into texts, in the law text, was much later on in the 20th century, especially after the horror of World War II. In the international arena, this idea of putting core values into law was the source and engine of many international human rights treaties and conventions, where freedom of expression, freedom of the press, freedom of association, freedom of demonstration, and freedom of religion, to name a few, are protected by law. Freedoms of citizens, core values of democracies, were laid down in international law as a guarantee against interference by the state. And let me be clear, and let me start by acknowledging and stressing that academic freedom is a core value in universities, where research and teaching are by definition intertwined. Academic freedom is a conditio sine qua non. Without academic freedom, a real university simply cannot function properly. And we can also go back to the famous English and Irish professor and writer John Newman, who lectured around 1850 about the idea of a university. And if you have any time, or maybe be a little bit bored, please go to the internet, look up John Newman and the idea of a university, and look in this book. And there you can learn that he said at that time already academic freedom in universities where research and teaching are intertwined is a conditio sine qua non. The university educates the intellect to reason well in all matters, to reach out towards truth and to grasp it. Nice words. But after a relatively quiet period in the 80s and 90s of the last century, academic freedom has been placed in the last 20 years more and more in the spotlights of controversy and debate. Is there a correlation with the rise of populism, social media use, distrust in politics, in the elite, and the growing popularity of conspiracy theories in the same period? Politics and policy is very much supported and even driven by science. It's called the scientification of politics and policy. The flip side from that brought us to the politicization of science. We come back to that later. Let's first concentrate on the concept of academic freedom. I start with two recent cases where academic freedom is at stake, one in Florida, the USA, and one here in Leiden. Related to the content, these cases are completely different, but both are considered as controversial. This year, in April, the state of Florida, the US Governor Ron DeSantis, broadly seen as the successor of Donald Trump, he is a Republican, he signed the new House Bill 7 to give business and families tools to stand up against woke indoctrination. The bill includes provisions to prevent discriminatory instruction in the workplace and in public schools. And at the occasion of the signing of the bill, the governor said, "In Florida, we will not let the far-left woke agenda take over our schools and colleges. There's no place for indoctrination in Florida." And the deputy said, along the same lines, "By signing this legislation, which is the first in the nation to end corporate wokeness and critical race theory in our schools, we are prioritizing education, not indoctrination. The new law means talking and teaching about critical race theory is forbidden." And the Commissioner of Education said, "I'm grateful that the Florida legislature has taken a stand against revisionist history and ideological concepts that are outside Florida's academic standards." The bill, now an act, also called the Stop Woke Act, came into effect 4 days ago, the 1st of July. Woke means, according to these Floridan politicians, wrongs against our kids and employees. The bill was, of course, contested by many inside and outside Florida. For example, by an organization called FIRE, which stands for Foundation for Individual Rights in Education, a non-partisan, non-profit organization based in Washington. Its mission is to defend and sustain the individual rights of students and faculty members at America's colleges and universities. These rights include freedom of speech, freedom of association, and academic freedom. FIRE sent letters to 40 public universities and colleges in Florida that will be impacted by the new act. FIRE wrote to the universities, "The enactment of the bill will lead to a chilling effect on faculty speech, with professors becoming more inclined to self-censor due to uncertainty about whether the discussion topic falls under the scope of the bill. The signing of this bill would not only interfere with faculty members' academic freedom, but also with the students' right to receive information unfettered by a pole of orthodoxy. In Florida, there are 14 public universities located, and they could face serious funding cuts as a consequence of violating this new law. For example, if critical race theory is part of a teaching program. Several lawsuits are pending against this law, but up until now without any success. So far, Florida. Now we go to another, as I said, totally different but recent example of an academic freedom debate at my own university here in Leiden. 4 months ago, a group of students want to organize a panel debate about the apartheid, the so-called apartheid policy in Israel against the Palestinians. They compare the policy of the Israeli government with the apartheid policy in South Africa in the last century. The event did not take place, however, in the university building. Why? You see here the logo of Universiteit Leiden, and I don't think you can read it, but if you could come close to it, you can see the letters Praesidium Libertatis, which is Latin for bastion of freedom. So the University of Leiden has a reputation when it comes to freedom, academic freedom, and it goes back to the founder of our university, William of Orange, in 1575, when he gave the university as a gift to the people of Leiden for their brave behavior against the Spaniard at that time. Freedom of thought, freedom of thinking, and freedom of exchanging thoughts was very important in his mind and still is very important in our university. So, what happened? Our rector would only allow the event to go ahead with this panel if guarantees could be given that the house rules of the university would be followed. That would mean an open debate on the basis of academic arguments with room for different perspectives in the whole. It is, in the end, Palestine, Israel, a very sensitive political topic. But in the panel were only academics with a view that supported the apartheid policy perspective. And the moderator of the debate was also of that opinion. That being the case, the rector decided the meeting could not take place within the university buildings and had to move elsewhere outside the university, which the students did. Interesting to see that the rector said it was a painful and difficult decision. We firmly support academic freedom and appreciate debates can be heated, but we are not a political platform. An academic debate can only be open if people with a different perspective feel able to speak out, and if the moderator in these kind of sensitive issues is preferable impartial. There were also objections from students who did not agree with the format. In the discussion with the organizing students, a neutral moderator was proposed by the rector but denied by the students. They already invited their moderator and wanted to hold on that. So, 2 cases, Florida, Leiden, about our subject, and you can see that it is alive and kicking. I said earlier, academic freedom is generally acknowledged as a core value of universities. That's nice, but is it also protected by law? The answer is yes, but the second question is, of course, is it enough protected? Academic freedom has been recognized as an international and national fundamental right. You will find it in many legal texts on different levels. The international level of conventions and treaties, the national level of constitutions and specific higher education legislation, and the level of self-regulation by international and national university associations. Nowadays, you can find it in the area of fundamental rights, guided by the United Nations, we can mention the UN Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights. You can find it in the recommendations of UNESCO, the United Nations Education, Science and Cultural Organization, and on European level you can find it in the EU Charter on the Fundamental Rights, and somewhat hidden under the freedom of expression, it's also to be found in the European Convention on Human Rights. And of course also in judgments from the EU Court of Justice and from the European Court of Human Rights. Let's zoom in somewhat more on those texts to get a grasp on it. First, the economic, social and cultural rights in the UN Covenant dating back to 1976. And there you can see that state parties have to respect freedom indispensable for scientific research, and the state parties, the parties who ratified this convention, this treaty, have to take steps necessary for conservation, development and diffusion of science. And that's the UN Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights. Those covenants of the UN all do have also monitoring bodies, mostly bodies of experts. And the monitoring body of this treaty has explained that the right to education can only be enjoyed if it is accompanied by academic freedom. If we then go to the UNESCO, the organization that has a central place in the United Nations system as far as academic freedom is concerned, in 1997 UNESCO adopted a useful recommendation concerning the status of higher education teaching personnel. Activities of science researchers should be promoted in national policy on the basis of utmost respect for autonomy and freedom of research. Each member state should institute procedures for ensuring that in the performance of research and development, scientific researchers respect public accountability while at the same time enjoying the degree of autonomy appropriate to their task and to advancement of science and technology. Article 16 of the recommendation continues to say that member states should establish conditions for academics to work in a spirit of intellectual freedom to pursue, expound and defend the scientific truth as they see it. It's clear, I think, academic freedom has an individual component belonging to the scientific workers in academia, and it has an institutional component addressing the autonomy of the institution they are working at. And this is not only law in the books, it's also law in action, as we take notice of the following. Last year, in November 2021, a joint UNESCO-ILO monitoring committee of experts, acting upon a complaint lodged by the UCU, that's the University and College Union in the United Kingdom, this committee of experts published an opinion about casualization of academic work and the impact on academic freedom. And the monitoring committee recognizes that the growth of casualized contracts in higher education in the UK is undermining academic freedom and therefore one of the fundamental pillars of excellence in teaching and research. It calls on the UK government to redress growing employment insecurity among higher education staff by enhancing policy measures that safeguard tenure. These experts' opinions, by the way, are not legally binding, but can certainly have policy impact. I was myself involved in the ILO, the International Labour Organization, a tripartite multilateral organization where governments, workers and employers are working together. And in the ILO, there's also monitoring bodies. And I've seen myself, in all the years that I was involved in it, that advised opinions made up by experts really are very influential to change the law, to change the practice in the member states of such a multilateral organization. So it's if it is not legally binding, it can be very influential. Let's go to the European level. What about Europe? We can find academic freedom in Article 13 of the EU Charter of Fundamental Rights. Dates back to 2007 and came into force in 2011, I think. And there, in Article 13, it is stated that arts and scientific research shall be free from constraint. Academic freedom shall be respected. That's it, that's all. What we find in the EU Charter. And in the European Convention on Human Rights, there is no special provision on academic freedom. You know, the EU Charter is from the EU, 27 countries in the EU, and the European Convention on Human Rights comes from the Council of Europe. Not 27, but 48 countries. Russia was a member up until 6 months ago or so. This Council of Europe has this European Court of Human Rights, and that have made many decisions. No, not so many, but a few decisions about this issue. As I said, the European Convention has no special provision. It protects the freedom of expression. But in the jurisprudence of the European Court of Human Rights, it's made clear that academic freedom has to be seen as a part of the freedom of expression. And they had several cases, of course, against Turkey. And in 3 cases against Turkey, the court decided that academic freedom comprises the academic freedom for academic personnel to express freely their opinion about the institution or the system in which they work, and freedom to distribute knowledge and truth without restriction. And in the case against Professor Kula, decided in 2018 by this court, it was decided that a disciplinary sanction against Professor Kula because of expressing his opinion at a TV program was violating the freedom of expression and his academic freedom, according to the court. Academic freedom should guarantee freedom of expression, freedom to communicate information, and freedom to disseminate knowledge. Important decisions, I think. And then the court belonging to the EU, this one with the nice ropes, as I said, Article 13, EU Charter of the Fundamental Rights, and this court also had to decide on a case from one of the EU members, named Hungary. Article 13 was used by the court in the case. The government of Hungary created new national law, which had to go and indeed led to the consequence that the Central European University, an American university, had to leave Budapest. This national Hungarian legislation was, according to the EU court, violating the provisions of the EU Charter in Article 13, relating to academic freedom. According to the court, academic freedom has not only an individual dimension, but also an institutional and organizational dimension. It protects the autonomy of higher educational institutions, national or international. The decision, however, came too late for this Central European University. It moved already to Vienna. That's easy to say, it moved to Vienna, but there are many people working there and many families also related to the work to that. So I think maybe 1,000 or 1,500 people had to move to Vienna, so it's not easily done. Later on, a new national law in Hungary gave the government the power to appoint the president of the Hungarian Academy of Science and to appoint the majority of the board. Again, violation of academic freedom, because autonomy of a scientific institution like the academy means that the board will be selected by its members, not by an outside body. This Hungarian law was, up until now, as far as I know, not contested before the European Court. Another level of regulation is self-regulation. Regulation made up by university associations. Like there is this Magna Carta Universitatum, which is a club an association of almost 1,000 or more universities across the globe from 88 countries. And they have a code, and they have, of course, acknowledged academic freedom. Freedom in research and training is the fundamental principle of university life. Governments and universities must ensure respect for this requirement. And importantly, it needs in-house maintenance and constant monitoring. I think maybe that's the main message that I have for you this day. It needs maintenance and constant monitoring. In a speech on the internet, the president of the Magna Carta, Seibold Noorda, made an important comment on this new code. He stressed that contrary to the appreciation for and trust in universities in the 20th century, in the 21st century, universities are more and more labeled as partisan, rather than as autonomous and serving the general interest. For universities, this shift in public support should be more than a matter of concern and complaint. It should be seen as a pressing invitation to rethink how the universities are serving society, how to do better, and in particular, how to respond to a context marked by division and diversity rather than by solidarity and unity. If they fail to do so, the universities fail to do so, their autonomy and freedom will risk to be taken for a cloak of self-interest and traditional elitism. To keep the trust of society on a high level, good and in-house maintenance of independence and integrity is crucial. Independence and integrity must be always present. Another association, the European University Association, I think there are members of officers of this association here in the hall. The European University Association organizes around 850 universities in 48 European countries. And of course, this association is also acknowledging that academic freedom is the single most important basis for meaningful academic research and teaching. It's a core value of university life. But the European University Association is very active in supporting academic freedom. It is involved, together with the European higher education area and the Bologna process, it's involved in the development of a European monitoring system on academic freedom. So I think that's important to mention. They are working on that. And in an international, in a global relationship, they're also together working on an academic freedom index, so that you could see in which countries in the world academic freedom is secured and in which countries it isn't. I think those are very important developments and supporting the idea of academic freedom. Of course, international law, international text, international recommendation, it's also important in national law. It is taken up in constitutions, in Germany, in Spain, also in Hungary. But as we can see, for instance, in Hungary, that is not watertight. And it's also taken up in specific law in higher education, for instance, in Ireland and in the Netherlands. And if you want to have a look at a proper regulation, I think you should look at the Ireland regulation, because they have a clear text, and a university shall have the right and responsibility to preserve and promote the traditional principles of academic freedom in the context of its internal and external affairs, and be entitled to regulate its affairs in accordance with its independent ethos and traditions and the traditional principles of academic freedom. So that's the institutional part. And then the individual part in the Irish law says that a member of the academic staff shall have the freedom within the law in his or her teaching, research, and any other activities, either in or outside the university, to question and test received wisdom, to put forward new ideas, and to state controversial or unpopular opinions and shall not be disadvantaged or subject to less favorable treatment by the university nor the exercise of that freedom. So this is, I think, a good example of a national regulation of what academic freedom is. And there are not so many countries, I'm afraid, that do have this clear regulation in their national law. For instance, here in the Netherlands, the only thing we have is an article in our higher education and research law, and the only thing that said there, the academic freedom will be respected at the institution of higher education and research. Yes, thank you very much. But is that enough? And you could compare this with Article 13 of the EU Charter, which I mentioned before, and there's also only said that academic freedom will be respected. So if you want to have more protection, be it on an EU level, be it on a national level, I think the Irish example can be of help. In the Netherlands, we have a discussion on this issue, and the current debate shows that it is not always self-evident what is to be understood. And that was the reason that we in the Royal Academy of Arts and Sciences of the Netherlands came together and thought about it and came up with a report. And I think that the most important conclusions of the report are that academic employees are free to perform scientific research, to disclose their findings, to teach, to choose research topic questions and methods, to have access to information sources, to publish, to collaborate with academic partners, to design academic education, to reach out to the public domain, and to pursue curiosity and creativity. Of course, all very important. So, if we go to see for a little in-between summary, we have seen there are two parts on academic freedom. There's the institutional part and the individual part. And if you like, we can go back to this great thinker, Isaiah Berlin, who gave a famous lecture in Oxford in 1958 about liberty. And he discerned two kinds, the freedom to do or to do not something, and the freedom from interference. Important issue, I think. And if you go through all the definitions we have heard until now, I think they vary a little, but the core is every time the same. There is a freedom to conduct research, a freedom to choose the subject and method of research, the freedom to associate and dialogue, freedom to publish, freedom to teach, and to reach out in the public domain. And the freedom from is the freedom from interference by government, by institutional boards, by business, or by society. So, lots of freedoms for us as academics, and you can feel it, there's always a but. And the but is, of course, that freedom comes with responsibilities. Rights come with responsibilities. So, let's have a look at that. Academic freedom is linked to the job. The relationships makes a clear distinction between academic freedom and a number of fundamental rights. For scientists, for example, the freedom of speech falls under academic freedom as long as the statements are related to the job as a scientist. This is not just about the freedom to report findings, which are based on careful documentation and evidence. Scientists should also be free to formulate hypotheses and express provisional views. As soon as scientists are expressing opinions on subjects outside their field of expertise, they have the freedom of speech just like all the other citizens, but cannot claim academic freedom. That goes, for instance, for the so-called public intellectuals, speaking and writing about all kinds of subjects beyond their field of discipline or expertise. Viewpoints must be based on academic research, and the role as academic employee differ from a role as a political activist. In our report of the Royal Academy, we made a kind of a framework where you can see that there are always 4 actors in place if we talk about academic freedom. You have the government, you have the institution, you have the scientist itself, and of course society. And if we go through all these blocks, you can see that if the government has, of course, a lot of obligations, and also if the government itself is a commissioning party, it may not attempt to influence the results of scientific research or prevent the publication. Government should not only guarantee the academic freedom of individual scientists, but also the autonomy of scientific institutions. And if we go further to the institutions, universities or research institutions, then they have also the duty to respect the freedom and the responsibility to protect the scientists at their institution from coercion and pressure by government, by commission parties and funding bodies, as well as fellow scientists. They should also protect the scientists from evil attacks on social media, no matter if these attacks are personal or professional. They should publicly stand behind their scientists. And university and faculty boards should also have an open mind for discussions with students. Students should have the possibility to organize academic discussions and invite teachers and experts from outside university and abroad. Society, of course, has also its obligations, and they should respect the independence of scientists and the independence of research and university institutions. Scientists themselves have, of course, also important obligations and responsibilities. You can see there we call the independency, transparency, integrity, and role awareness. And that brings us to a very important issue for the individual scientist, but of course they have to respect and they have to deliver honesty, reliability, objectivity, impartiality, independency, and transparency. So let's now look into a few dilemmas, challenges, threats to academic freedom. I've made up a list here. It can be longer, but I thought that one of the dilemmas and threats is the funding, the erosion of tenure, the projectification of research. So you all know the different flows of funding for universities, the flow from Europe, the flow from the National Science Agency, but the first flow directly coming from the Ministry of Education diminished in the last couple of years, I think, the last 10, 15 years or so. So to be successful as a researcher, you have to apply with projects in many places, but that means that the flexible workforce on universities is growing and growing. So this is a very serious dilemma. Another dilemma, of course, here we have the flows of funding. A second dilemma, of course, is the growing authoritarianism, the decline of multilateralism. We already mentioned Hungary and Turkey, and we can also think of China, Russia, of course, India, Brazil. And mind you, we are talking here of half of the global population, 3 billion people. Then we have, of course, the potential conflicts of interest with business and business partnerships. You have maybe read the issue of the Uber papers in the last week, and that Uber contracted university economists in Germany and France to do the job for them and to write favorite articles about the Uber organization. The same went with Mr. Roger Scruton. He was a philosophy professor in the UK and wrote sympathetic articles about tobacco. And later on it came out that he was paid by the tobacco companies to do so. So that, of course, you shouldn't do. Potential conflict of interest. Of course, also the example of the pharmaceutical industry. We have in the law the question of tax lawyers and tax law professors, tax lawyers working to avoid paying tax for big companies, etc. And we have, of course, policy-related research, for instance, in the climate. Another dilemma and threat is, of course, deplatforming and cancel culture. The FIRE NGO, which I mentioned earlier, has a disinvitation database on its website. Interesting. And they account disinvitations in the United States. And as from 2000, they already had 500 plus disinvitations in universities and colleges. And in the Netherlands, we had also a famous case, but also in the UK, that the Canadian psychology professor, Jordan Peterson, was cancelled in the UK. He wasn't allowed to speak there. In the Netherlands, we had a discussion about that, but here, it was, in fact, in Amsterdam, he was allowed to speak. But then in Parliament, there were questions about it, and then the minister said, the member, the minister, the Dutch Minister of Education said, it's not up to the government to decide about this, but to the institution and its academic community. The only right answer, I think, that the minister would give here. Dan already mentioned the threatening academics on social media. There are personal threats on professional credibility and personal security, very serious and very dangerous sometimes. So that's also an important thing to elaborate on. Threats to, of course, in the context of COVID-19, of virologists and epidemiologists, but also in everyday life now, climate scientists or migration scholars are under threat on a daily basis. So we have seen that politics are more and more leaning on science to develop policy, but so that's the scientification of politics, but the flip side is the politicization of science. And there you see Dr. Fauci, the well-known, I think, scientist in the US during the COVID situation, fighting with the then president. So politicians refer to academic research, and that may endanger audience perception of the role of academics. So let's come to a conclusion, and then we have some time for discussion. I think that we have seen that academic freedom is a threefold concept. It's academic freedom to research, to teach in freedom. It's academic freedom from interference by institutional boards, by governments, etc. And the academic freedom, and I think that's important, is needing permanent in-house maintenance. It's twofold, but the third one is, of course, the responsibility of scientists themselves. Coming to the end of my lecture, I would say the last question could be, what is the justification of academic freedom? Why is it that should be there? I think it's important to stress that the justification lies not in the comfort or convenience of academic teachers, researchers and students. The justification lies in the benefits for society. The long-term interests of a society are best served when the educational process leads to the advancement of knowledge. And knowledge is best advanced when inquiry is free. Free from restraint, free from interference. Academic freedom needs and deserves in-house maintenance and discussion. It would be maybe a good idea, as I learned they did in Ireland, to develop teaching models on this topic. A teaching model on the idea of a university, a teaching model on academic freedoms, to be sure that the fundamental idea of a university will stay well understood. Thank you very much.
Dear Professor van der Heijden, I would like to thank you for this very engaging presentation and invite you for a discussion from questions from the audience, which you can send in via Slido to us using the QR code already provided. And we already have a few questions, so I would like to invite you to the discussion based on the questions we already have. Yeah, it's also here. So we have a question about from online, namely that in a context in which we still don't have equal access to higher education and to results of academic research, how can we justify complete academic freedom? Is the public lack of trust in science and its neutrality not also reasonable? So
the letters are too small for me.
Yes, so yeah, okay, there you go.
In a context in which we still don't have equal access to higher education, how can we?
And this is like in the international setting, of course.
Yeah. Is the public lack of trust in science and its neutrality not also reasonable? No, it's not reasonable. In my mind. And maybe it's interesting that in the Netherlands we have an institute called the Rathenau Institute, which does on a long-term basis research into the question if society is trusting scientists and trusting universities. And the answer is yes. Yes. A very high percentage of the people, at least in the Netherlands, have trust in their scientists and in their universities. And maybe it could be else in other countries in Europe. Maybe some of you know about that a little bit. But for us here, we are not so afraid of a lack of trust in science, in general, of course. And if you just leave Twitter what it is for a while, and then you think what's going on, then the outcome of the research is there is a lot of trust.
And do you maybe see an erosion of this trust in the last 3 years, or do you see that maybe society is getting a bit segregated between those who trust and those who distrust science?
Yes, of course. That's one of the dilemmas and threats that I noted. And that, of course, has to do with the social media and Twitter and Insta and what have you. And I think that we should be aware of it, of course, and stand up to it. As I said, that for instance, the board of universities have the responsibility to stand up against fights on Twitter if the fight is directed to their scientists, and not just to say, oh, it is only Twitter, just let it go, but be active there and do something about it, because otherwise maybe the erosion could go further. But of course, the erosion of trust is a wider problem, and it has to do with all the other developments in society, like populism, like fragmentation of politics. We have 20 political parties now in our parliament, so you are very lucky if you are a government. So the fragmentation, populism, and the lack of trust of society in politics, I think, is growing, not so much in science.
Thank you for that, and I think that's indeed an important point in this sense. And we also thought about the politicization of science, like what is the role scientists can take in this process and where to draw the boundaries of interaction with politics and industry. And in this sense, I also have a question with regard to the role of scientists and the institution and governments. You mentioned that the role of the government is funding in order to ensure academic freedom, yet we know that many systems that we work in Europe and globally are structurally underfunded. So researchers are relying more and more on cooperation with industry and outside bodies, which leads to your last points that you mentioned about trust in research in this sense. And I really enjoyed the differentiation you make about the freedoms of academics, but also the institutional freedoms. And I would also like to bring in maybe the concept of institutional support that you already mentioned in academic freedom. And how do you see in this world where funding becomes so diffuse and researchers depend on this kind of money that comes with a request, how do you see the role of institutional support, and what is your advice maybe to young academics in such a changing environment?
Yes, well, I think that the question of funding is a very important question, and it's of course up to the national governments and the national ministers of higher education to do something there and to be active. And what we have seen is what I have called the projectification of research, so you get project by project by project, and of course not getting tenure but on a flexible basis. And that's of course in the end eroding the permanence of free research. So in the ideal world, which of course never ever will exist, but in the ideal world, I think we should go back a little bit in time. If you are as old as I am, you know that there was a time that the first flow of funding by the government to the universities was enough to do research of your own choosing. When I was writing my PhD long time ago, I could choose myself, my subject. I was working here at the University of Leiden. Nobody asked me, why do you do that? It was just my idea to do that subject. And I did it together with my teaching. That was a full-time job, writing your PhD, teaching, and that's it, all on the first floor, no project at all. So I think we are now living in the opposite world, that you always should have a project, because otherwise no chance to be a PhD. And I think we should go back a little more to the older time, that the first flow of funding at least gives some room to choose your own subject. And as a matter of fact, the same Royal Academy of Science in the Netherlands made an advice to our Minister of Education to come up with what we called rolling grants. And I think that's interesting for you as well, to come up in your country, and if you're involved in policy matters or of higher education or working there, I think that the idea of a rolling grant is interesting, because it means that every new appointed professor gets a sum of money for maybe 2 PhDs, free to choose for him and her and the PhDs to do what they like. So then you have something going back to the first flow of money that we used to have, and you are not so much depending on the second flow, which comes from the National Research Agency on project basis, or you go to the 95 billion of Horizon 2027. A lot of money, 95 billion euros, but it's for 5-6 years, but also always on the project basis. You have to come up with a project to the ERC, the European Research Council, or other councils or other EU institutions.
Thanks a lot for mentioning this idea of rolling funds. I think it's something that we are getting more and more excited about in the Netherlands, so nice to share with people from other countries as well. And of course, the many questions that we as young academics have is like, who should get this? Is it only newly appointed professors? Because of course you have to become a professor, or is it already associate professors or postdocs, or where do you draw the boundaries? But I think this is an interesting ongoing discussion in our country.
Yes. That's a fight you should fight with your...
Exactly, within your own systems. Many of the questions are related exactly to this topic of the interplay between politics and industry and the potential risk of for academic freedom of industry funding and also political influence. So these kind of topics, of course, are very contemporary and important and come up in many questions. Do you maybe have some overall words on these topics of politicization and industrialization of research, and how some strategies that you can think of, institutions that can think of, and individual researchers that can think of in this changing context.
Yes, I think if you are working as a research with a commission and party, be it the government, be it an industry, be it an NGO, all is possible. I think that the most important thing that right at the start, you sign a declaration of independence, so that you are sure as a researcher that your partner, your contract partner, knows about the independence of the researchers and know that the research will be published. There's no secret research. The research will be published, and there's a declaration of independence right before the start of the research. I think that's important to realize before you start.
Thank you. I think that's a really.
And the second is, and that's of course important for researchers and academics, that they have to be transparent about the relationships with NGOs, with businesses, with government, etc. So if you are involved one way or another, which is of course preferable, of course you live in a broad society, but mention it, be transparent about it, don't hide it. Mention that you are working for that business, or that you were a member there, if you were a former employee, whatever, or that you are in a committee of the government for the same issue. Mention it, don't hide it, be transparent. I think that's very important also. To stay as a high trust institution.
And maybe this also in relation with the development in open science nowadays, that we have support and policies for open science will hopefully help a lot in this transition to talk about your research funding and the clarity of publishing. Let me see. I think this. So there's also questions about how to deal with academics who are demanding freedom of speech on stages, but then talking about topics outside of their expertise. I think this is a bit different topic from Tobias Hoffmann, which happened a lot during COVID. So this goes a bit toward this whole Twitter world and people having. So you already mentioned, of course, the freedom of speech and freedom of academic, which are not the same. But if you have any further thoughts on this topic,
again, I think it's not easy. But if you are on the television as a researcher to tell us something about vaccines or COVID, because that's your expertise, tell us all about it based on your expertise. That's not the same as saying something about the policy development. Policy development is for politicians or policy makers. And researchers are just telling the outcome of their research. So you have to make a difference between, on the one hand, what you're saying on the basis of your expertise, and on the other hand, of what you, as a citizen, as a civilian, would like to happen and would like to be the policy. And that's easy said, as I know, and in the Netherlands, but you have also in your countries this talking programs, talk shows, and those talk shows are not so much, in my view at least, to inform people. It's entertainment. Yeah. It's most important is entertainment. So I think you should be aware if you go there as a scientist. You can go there, of course, and explain what you know on the basis of your research. And then it goes on with entertainment. And of course you can tell jokes as you like, but that has nothing to do with being a scientist.
Thank you for that. I would like maybe quickly see if there are other topics. I think most of these topics were related, so we discussed.
I see.
Yes, China. I see there was just maybe last question. I think it's still related. How do you see the discussion on China opening a university campus in Europe? This is, of course, a bit different topic, but maybe interesting to close the discussion.
Yeah, sure. Yes, of course, we should have, and we should permanently have a dialogue and a discussion with our Chinese colleagues. And we do that, of course, in many places in the world to do it. But at the same time, we should be aware that we are living in different cultures and in different ways, that they see the world and that we see the world and that others see the world. So if you are aware of that, I think we should continue the dialogue and try to learn from each other. Of course, if you talk about freedoms, freedom of speech and freedom of press, freedom of association, I'm afraid that doesn't exist in China. So be aware of that, and then you can go on. And of course, talk about it, and if they are free to talk about it with you, it's nice. But be aware of the differences in the different cultures that we are talking with. Yeah.
Thank you for those answers, and thank you for your presentation. I would like to thank you all for your participation here, and wish you a lot of enjoyment in the ESOF conference in the upcoming sessions.
Thank you very much.